Okay, today we will be on modern slavery. And the first category is the wage slave.
Wage slavery, which they regarded as not very different from chattel slavery. In fact, this was such a popular view that it was actually a slogan of the Republican Party, that the only difference between working for a wage and being a slave is that working for a wage is supposedly temporary.
They and their families were as effectively held and immobilized on those farms in the 1890s and into the 1900s as their grandparents had been held as slaves in the same places before the Civil War. Almost all sharecroppers were never able to pay back the debts to the landowners on whose land they worked. They effectively were peons, even though they were not called that at the time.
Freedom is a spectrum with chattel slaves on the left and slave masters on the right. The foundation of the wage-slave relationship is the economic dependency of the slave on the master. Wage slavery changes the form of compensation from food and shelter to money, which can theoretically be used to purchase food and shelter. Although free in name, most Americans are broke, in debt, live paycheck to paycheck, and couldn't walk away from their jobs without losing their homes. The average worker today works 24% more than a 14th century peasant. In 1 year, this is the equivalent of an additional 2 months of work. Freedom to most Americans is largely an illusion. So how can the working masses win back their time and increase their freedom? Well, they can bargain for better working conditions, but at the end of the day, employers have no incentive to offer this given the increasingly competitive labor market. And it doesn't solve the fundamental master-slave dynamic caused by the economic dependence that's the root cause of all of this. The closest we have to a silver bullet is a universal basic income, an unconditional cash transfer that every citizen gets that provides just enough to pay for basic living expenses. This removes the master-slave dynamic and gives workers the freedom to walk away from their jobs and spend their time how they wish. Sweden doesn't have a basic income, but they're a great example of how a generous safety net can promote greater risk-taking and entrepreneurship. Freedom in name is not the same as freedom in reality. Just ask Frederick Douglass.
You have owners. They own you. They own everything. They own all the important land. They own and control the corporations. They've long since bought and paid for the Senate, the Congress, the state houses, the city halls. They got the judges in their back pockets, and they own all the big media companies, so they control just about all of the news and information you get to hear. They got you by the balls. They spend billions of dollars every year lobbying to get what they want. Well, we know what they want. They want more for themselves and less for everybody else. But I'll tell you what they don't want. They don't want a population of citizens capable of critical thinking. They don't want well-informed, well-educated people capable of critical thinking. They're not interested in that. That doesn't help them. That's against their interest. That's right. They don't want people who are smart enough to sit around the kitchen table to figure out how badly they're getting fucked by a system that threw them overboard 30 fucking years ago. They don't want that. You know what they want? They want obedient workers. Obedient workers. People who are just smart enough to run the machines and do the paperwork and just dumb enough to passively accept all these increasingly shittier jobs with the lower pay, the longer hours, the reduced benefits, the end of overtime, and the vanishing pension that disappears the minute you go to collect it. And now they're coming for your Social Security money.
Being forced to be something like slaves, they argued that if you're say a journeyman, a craftsman, and you sell your product, you're selling what you produced. If you're a wage earner, you're selling yourself, which is deeply offensive.
And I think that splitting hairs about what's slavery, what's involuntary servitude, what's forced labor, is a distracting exercise. The reality is, millions of Black people in remote parts of the South could not leave the farms they were being held on. If they did, they were subject to arrest by the sheriff. And if they were arrested, they would then be returned to the very same farms, oftentimes in chains, receiving nothing. That is slavery. That's a form of slavery.
We're going to need to go ahead and move you downstairs into storage B.
No,
we have some new people coming in, and we need all the space we can get.
But there's no space.
So if you could just go ahead and pack up your stuff and move it down there, that would be terrific.
I would.
Okay.
I could stay.
Okay, so there's a theory that say we should provide a universal basic income, but will that work? Okay, wage slavery is a term used to describe a situation where a person's livelihood depends on wages or a salary, especially when the wages are low and persons have few realistic chances of upward mobility. The term is sometimes used to criticize exploitation of labor and social stratification, with the former seen primarily as an unequal bargaining power between the labor and the capital, and the latter as a lack of workers' self-management, fulfilling job choices and leisure in an economy. But this is not new. Even back in 1763, there's a French journalist who has published an influential description of wage slavery. The slave was precious to his master because of the money he had cost him. They were worth at least as much as they would be sold for in the market. It is the impossibility of living by any other means that compels our form of farm laborers to till the soil whose fruits they will not eat, and our mansions to construct buildings in which they will not live. It is want that compels them to go down on their knees to the rich people in order to get from him permission to enrich him, which effective gain the suppression of slavery bots. He is free, you say, that is his misfortune. This man has the most terrible and most impervious of masters, that is need. They must therefore find somewhere to hide them or die of hunger. Is that to be free? Again, using poverty as a mean of controlling people. There are many similarities between wage work with slavery. Since the cattle's slave is property, his value to the owner is in some ways higher than that of a worker who may quit, be fired, or replaced. The chattel slave's owner has made a greater investment in terms of the money paid for the slave. For this reason, in times of recession, chattel slaves would not be fired like wage laborers. A wage slave would also be harmed at no cost. American chattel slaves in the 19th century have improved their standard of living from the 18th century. And according to historians, plantation records show that slaves worked less, were better fed, and worked only occasionally. Their material conditions in the 19th century being better than what was typically available to free urban laborers at the time. This was partially due to slave psychological strategies under economic system different from the capitalist wage slavery. According to Mark Smith of the Economic History Society, although intrusion and oppression, paranoidism, the way master employed it, and the methods slaves used to manipulate, rendered slaveholders' attempts to institute capitalistic work regimens on their plantation ineffective, and so allowed the slaves to carve out a degree of autonomy. Unfortunately for a wage slave, they can choose between employers, but those employers usually constitute a minority of owners in the population for which the wage laborer must work, while attempts to implement workers' control on employers' businesses may be considered as an act of theft or insubordination, and thus be met with violence, imprisonment, or other legal and social measures. The wage laborer's second choice is to work for an employer or to face poverty or starvation. If a chattel slave refuses to work, a number of punishments are also available, from beatings to food deprivation. Although economically rational slave owners practice positive reinforcement to achieve best results and before losing their investment by killing an expensive slave.
So Albert, these chattel slaves, does that mean that the employer provides them with a comfortable place to live or something or other, but doesn't pay them a wage? Is that what it means?
Yeah. Yes, it is. Chattel slave means the slave in traditional sense. That means a person has been bought, and then after that, the person belongs to the slave owner, and hence the slave owner have to provide for the slave's survival. And obviously, the slave owner will also make the slave work.
Mm.
So chattel slave is what we normally understand as a slave. The person is being owned by the slave owner. But if we look at the working conditions for many different people today, sometimes we are even worse than slaves, because the owner can just send you off, say, sorry, you are fired. And then you are left with yourself and to bear with the consequences of unemployment, which may mean starvation and all sorts of things.
But to treat people as slaves, obviously they didn't think they were human, did they?
Yes, well,
They were not considered human, obviously.
the next question is, are we also considered human when we are working in a factory, for example?
No, I'm talking about the slavery that was practiced in the American South.
Yeah, then they are not considered human. They are considered as poverty. So there's a slight difference here, is this so-called status. But in terms of the living, the livelihood of the slaves and the livelihood of some of the lowest wage earners, the condition is very similar. That is why I bring this up, is we have to consider wage when it is not paid enough to make a person really enjoy lives, then it is not much difference from slavery. Another issue is today's work has no satisfaction, basically. We humans will need mental stimulation in order to enjoy ourselves. So, for example, when you tackle a very difficult problem, and then when you solve the problem, you almost got an empathy, a enjoyment, which is you can't get somewhere else. And that's exactly why we have so many people playing sports, because they want to challenge themselves and get better and better. So one way of human enjoyment is constant challenge. But in a factory, the owner will never give you a challenge, because if they give you a challenge, something you can't do, that means the job won't be done. So the job you are doing is always below your capability. Whereas what we want to do, challenge ourselves, is do something just above our capability, so that it becomes a challenge for us to enjoy the result of the challenge. But in factory work, you will not be given a task which is beyond your ability. You will always be given a task below your ability in order for the task to finish. So it's basically very dulled, very bored in factory work and in normal wages.
But in the West, what's happening now, or it's happened for some time, is that with automation and robotics and so on, a lot of those mundane jobs are being removed from people, done by machines. And when we have this artificial intelligence, what's going to happen is then even the thinking jobs are going to be taken away from humans. And most humans, so there'll be concentration of power. And then most humans, what are they going to be doing? We'll have to be fiddling our thumbs.
Now, in terms of the so-called the working hours be reducing, was not new. We have been talking about reducing the working hours almost 1 or 2 centuries ago. When we started this industrial processing, we see a lot of material are being produced, and we think, okay, if we have a lot of material being produced, that means we will have a very satisfactory material life, and therefore we don't have to work so hard. But what we have seen is actually we are working harder than ever before. For example, with internet, there's no more 9 to 5. Your boss can call you anytime, even at night, to discuss about work. And so the boundary of working hours, 9 to 5, has now all gone. Yeah, you're right. What we are going to see is the replacement of repetitive task by technology. Any task which will be repeated a number of times, it will be replaced by technology. That is very true. But what will be our future human lives? We don't know. My optimistic dream is that we will have a sufficient renewable energy in our homes, so that we have power energy to use. And then most of the tasks, repetitive tasks, will be performed by some robots, even in the house. For example, the cleaning, the sweeping, all these things, even the cooking may be done automatically. And then the next question is how we are going to afford this kind of living. Well, if we think in that way, we are still within this wage slave mentality. Why don't we think it in another way? Say, by birth, you own your house with all the automation and energy. And then you have a little garden around your house, which produce the bulk of your needs. So basically what you need to do is probably doing a little bit of maintenance to your property. For example, the solar panel might need replacing, and a little bit of this, little bit of that, to reduce the total working hours back to our hunter-gatherers times. Remember, before the agricultural revolution, humans lived as hunter-gatherers. The women usually work about 3 hours in the morning to gather food, and that's it. And then for the rest of the day, they probably will be looking after the children, talking, playing, doing a little bit knitting, etc., and cooking, basically. For the men, the life's even better. They will gather around, talking, drinking, and then every now and then, maybe once, twice a week, go out, hunt some meat home, and then share it with the family. The family is very happy. Hey, today we have meat. But the man probably is working only maybe 2 days a week. The rest of the time, they may be making arrows, making spears, talking, drinking. Good time. So if our environment is able to provide for our living, and with intelligence, we can reduce our physical work, then this is, I think, a optimistic future. Pessimistically, they will say, well, we don't need any workers. The workers are now redundant. Their livelihood, none of our business. The rich people employ a few, and then to look after themselves, the rest of us is left alone. That may be another pessimistic view. We don't know, but maybe.
Albert, if you, I don't know whether you watched the COP26 conference, but if you did watch the COP26 conference, I think we realized that we humans will find a way to stuff it up. We'll find a way. It may be a different way, ingenious way, but we will find a way.
Yeah. But anyway, let's return to this wage slavery, and let's move on to some more extreme thinking, like Karl Marx. Okay, wage slavery was a class condition in place due to the existence of private property and the state. This class situation rests upon the existence of property not intended for active use, the concentration of ownership in a few hands, the lack of direct access by workers to the means of production and consumption of goods, and the perpetuation of reserve army of unemployed workers. So that is looking at our human society as a class struggle. We have the ownership class or the capitalist class, and then the rest of the population. And the capitalist class control all the means of productions. So, for example, we don't have, we might have a house, okay, and in the house you can't produce for yourself. You need other things in order to produce for you to make sure you can continue living. But if we change that, say we own our own house, we also own the land around our own house, which will produce sufficient food for me to live on that land, then I will not need to work for any owners. So there's one important concept here is the existence of property which is not intended for active use. The idea is if we have a property, for example, our own land, a house, our own land, which is in active use, that means the land becomes productive. You have fruit trees, you have veggie gardens, it has chickens, etc., etc. It's a productive. Then we can live on this piece of land without working. Then the dynamics will change. So it's very interesting to notice that a lot of suburbs like ours, the front garden, most of them is not in active production. It's just a lawn. If we change the front garden into a veggie patch, for example, then we reduce a lot of consumption in the supermarket because we will produce our own fruit. And again, if we have a community in a street, I may have an orange tree. The next door neighbor may have an apple tree. The neighbor downstairs, there may be a pear tree, etc., etc. Once a fruit tree fruits, it has more fruit than a family can consume. So you share it with your neighbors. By that means different fruit tree maturing at different times provide us with different fruits throughout the whole year. There's another idea to consider. Then the whole street may not need to work because we can share food from different aspects. Of course, nowadays we have so much industrialized products, clothes, watches, eyeglasses, etc. But if the land can produce a little bit of surplus, then we can sell the surplus to make a little bit of money, which can be used to get our technology. That's maybe another way. But anyway, let's move on. And secondly, the waste of workers' effort and resources on producing useless luxuries. That is where when you have a privileged class with a lot of money, then this class will have some luxuries. And luxuries is luxury. That means it have no particular value except it is a luxury. The waste of goods so that their price may remain high. We know that, for example, in our supermarket, there's a lot of weightage in terms of food, etc. The waste of all those who sit between the producer and the consumer, taking their own shares at each stage without actually contributing to the production of goods. That means the middleman. But it looks like the middleman is now being squeezed by technology. We can buy direct from manufacturer. So why are they working poor?
US homeless shelters are struggling to accommodate the growing number of poor Americans. The face of the average tenant, though, has certainly been changing over the past few years. And sometimes even a full-time job doesn't mean that you can afford a place to live. RT's Marina Portnaya filed the story.
The working poor have become among America's fastest growing demographic. Charmaine works full-time as a telephone data collector.
I make about $250 a week, depending on the hours that I work.
On many days, the 38-year-old eats a free dinner at the New York City Rescue Mission before heading to the place she's called home for the past 5 years.
I come here to eat at the mission, then jump on the train, get back to the shelter for curfew at 8 o'clock. If you don't make it back to the shelter at 8 o'clock, they've already packed up your clothes.
A record high of 50,000 people currently occupy New York City's shelters. Of those living in them, city figures show 28% of families and 16% of adults are employed.
The jobs are not paying you what they should be paying you, first of all. And everything is, the prices are just up on everything. You know, it's just not affordable at all.
In 2011, 46% of New Yorkers were considered either poor or almost poor. The income gap in America's richest city is comparable to those of some sub-Saharan African countries.
We see people coming somewhat maybe embarrassed, ashamed. They're hardworking. They hate to have to ask for a handout. But at the end of the day, if you can't put food on the table for your family, what are you going to do?
In an effort to have supply meet demand, the New York City Rescue Mission recently began renovations to expand its space from 3 floors to 6. Next year, twice the amount of people will be fed and twice the amount of beds will be provided to the hungry and homeless, many of whom are working Americans. Former U.S. President Jimmy Carter has spent 3 decades promoting and building affordable homes. He says America's income inequality is causing members of today's middle class to resemble those who lived in poverty when he was in office in the late 70s.
Compared to when I left the White House, the difference is twice as great as it was between the richest people and the poorest people.
Charmaine was once a freelance makeup artist for Revlon and managed a cosmetic store. Life changed following the financial crisis of 2008 when she lost her job. So when she hears today U.S. officials brag about an economic recovery,
they're saying it, but they don't really take a look at it because it's not true. I see more people struggling out here, and they're working, and they're on welfare, and they still can't make it.
Leaving millions struggling to find opportunity in the land that always promised it. Marina Portnaya, RT, New York.
The question is, should working people be homeless? Besides the wage slaves, there's another class of slaves in the richest country today. This is the legal slaves.
So I got caught off guard by something recently. It has to do with the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which abolished slavery. The amendment reads, in part, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, shall exist within the United States. All of that made perfect sense to me, minus this one part, except as a punishment for crime. Basically, that says you can punish a criminal with slavery. And we do, all over the country, all the time. It's called prison labor. We're all sort of familiar with the idea. Prisoners making license plates is the classic example. But that is the tip of the iceberg. Across the country, convicts do work in carpentry, sewing, mining, packaging, firefighting, telemarketing, fish farming, and artisanal cheese making. That last one is why this is back in the news. Whole Foods took some flack for selling felon-made cheese, and at a pretty hefty markup. Now, according to the American Civil Liberties Union, this isn't inherently a problem.
Most prisoners want to work, and jobs for prisoners can be a very positive thing.
That's David Fauci from the ACLU's National Prison Project.
But given the vast power inequality between prisoners and their employers, there's also a real potential for exploitation and abuse.
That potential is grounded in the fact that this really is slave labor. Inmates can be forced to work as long as they're deemed fit, and can be punished if they don't, including in some cases with solitary confinement. And then there's the question of money. We don't have to pay prisoners a dime for their work. Some states do require that prisoners are paid, but courts have consistently ruled that any pay is, quote, by the grace of the state. In other words, just to be nice. Meaning more broadly that prisoners are highly vulnerable.
Prisoners can't unionize. If they're injured or killed on the job, in most states they're not protected by workers' compensation. So all of this creates a situation where the usual checks on employer exploitation and abuse simply don't operate.
This all means that there's no consistency in what prisoners are paid for those cheese wheels and telemarketing calls. Pay scales range from nothing to around the federal minimum wage, but many are paid under $1 an hour. And that can give the state what Fauci calls a perverse incentive to keep the prison population high.
Last year, when California was ordered to release some prisoners to relieve overcrowding, the state actually argued against it on the ground that it would reduce the state's access to prisoner labor.
Things get more uncomfortable when you consider that America does not have a great track record when it comes to prison labor. After the Civil War, southern states struggled with a sudden lack of slave labor, thanks to the 13th Amendment. And their solution, in part, was to use that same clause, except as a punishment for crime, as a loophole. Many states passed broadly racist vagrancy laws that allowed authorities to pick up blacks on charges like loitering, imprison them when they couldn't pay fines, and lease them out en masse to places like plantations. In other words, the South got its slaves back. This system of convict leasing wasn't totally abolished until 1941. Back here in 2015, though, what are we supposed to think about prison labor? Prisoners are treated light years better today, whether they're working or not. But there are also so many more of them. Our prison system has exploded since the 1980s, giving America far and away the biggest prisoner population in the world. And that population is racially skewed in the extreme. Around 40% of prisoners are black, even though only about 13% of the country is overall. The 13th Amendment, the abolition of slavery, that happened 150 years ago. And now, 150 years later, we have this prison system instead. And according to David Fauci, we should think hard about why we do.
The purpose of incarceration should be to protect public safety, not to provide a captive labor force for the government.
Okay, so I will stop the share and then we can have some discussion. Anyone would like to start with a question or something or comment?
That initial video of the chap fired up politically about education, lack of education, and deliberate lack of education to keep people in their place. It's sort of happening in Australia with the way this government is treating universities and research and things like that. I just wonder if an Albanese sort of person could get up and talk like that and actually win votes, or whether it's too far. It's just more than people could cope with and turn them right off. But you know, it's about time maybe the opposition explained this more clearly. What's happening in Australia with lack of educational opportunities for people on a wide scale, rather than the privileged getting access to the universities. We did have a while when Whitlam was around and we had free universities.
Yeah.
And that's
a lot of us benefited from the free education. I myself benefited from the free education myself. When I was in Hong Kong, and my primary education is highly subsidized. My secondary education is also highly subsidized. And then when I was able to get in the university, then the government provided us with a student loan, which is affordable, I eventually pay off quite comfortably, and then I'm free. So I benefited from the free education. Obviously, that makes my life different if I haven't got the education. But we are seeing the second the education cost increasing. I think that is a problem, and obviously people have choice. For example, I choose to send my daughter to a private school, which is quite expensive. She would have get an equal education in government schools, but we see that the government is actually not providing sufficient funding to secondary schools. For example, compared with the private school, they are funded much better, and that is a difference. And then we are still lucky in that our universities will be available to most our citizens. If they are not affordable, they still have a loan, and then the current loan is still affordable. But the situation is in some country, for example, the obvious country is United States. There are student that is talking about trillions of US dollars, and that is a huge burden to the middle class and the lower class. The real issue is actually the shrinking of the middle class in the United States. They used to have about a 75% people are classified as middle class in the 1970s. Today it dropped to about 50%. So 20-something% is gone. And that is, I don't see any reason why a rich country have to be like that.
I find it all very puzzling because I was born in Sri Lanka, and Sri Lanka is considered a third world country. But from the 1950s, it's had free education right through to university and free health for every citizen.
Yeah.
And I just can't understand it. What is very worrying, I think, even in America, they're trying to bring this Build Back Better program, spending trillions to help people like that lady who was, homeless and so on. But the very people who can be helped by these programs don't seem to support it. Like some of the states, you've got the senators who are, who are pretty well-to-do, and most of and they come from states that are quite poor. There must be many poor people there, but obviously they're stopping this thing being passed. I just can't understand why poor people would vote against their own interests.
Yeah.
I find it very puzzling. And one last thing that I want to say, Tony Blair, I think he had the former British Prime Minister, he had some think tank. And he said that about 10 years ago, 15 years ago, he would go to these countries, mostly in Africa, I suppose, where had dictatorships. And the dictators would say, look, we know we should become a democracy. And they will give some excuse saying, people are not ready, or some other excuse for not being a democracy. But the same leaders he goes and sees now tell him, we don't want to be a democracy. See what's happened to democracies around the world. They're in a mess. It's quite sad.
Now, democracy is the general population is looked after by the government. So at the moment, unfortunately, democracy has narrowed its meaning to that the government is selected by election. That is what we understood as democracy today. But unfortunately, that isn't the correct understanding of democracy. So I'm proposing to actually start asking the question, what do we want our government to do? And then we judge our government by whether they deliver the kind of services that we want the government to deliver. And then we started to rethink how we can actually get a group of people to the government level in order to deliver the kind of services that we want. By election, I don't think this is a good method. For example, I'm sick. I want to have some medicine. I'm not going out in the street and ask everybody what kind of medicine I should take. I will go to my doctor and ask an expert in health to tell me what to do with my illness. So it is ridiculous that the most important task of a country, governing the country, is like asking anybody in the street how I should treat my disease. That isn't it. That isn't the best way. I think we have to seriously rethink how we are going to choose our leaders. Yes, please.
Yeah, well, I have been a researcher and academic for 30 odd years myself. And one thing I find with the internet is that everybody is an expert today. So people do not respect expertise anymore. My daughter, who's a doctor, she tells me that sometimes patients will come to her and tell her, they have got this problem. And when my daughter tries to explain it to them, they will say, "Doctor, I read this on the internet. I read that on the internet." And then she tries to explain to them that it's a bit more complicated than that. There are other repercussions, there are other manifestations. So what we are finding is that people do not respect expertise anymore in a field.
Yeah.
Like the climate change thing, 99.2% of the climate scientists, research is done in a way where if you're wrong, someone will correct you. They will make their reputation by correcting you. It's a self-governing system. So, but these guys, 99.5% of the climate scientists, they would say that humans impact global warming, and global warming is happening. But look at the people who are opposing it. There are people who come from a law background or some other background. They're not experts in the field, but the people buy it. The people buy it. I just can't understand why people would buy it. Why not? You're saying, Albert, if you are sick, you go to a doctor. So why is it that people do not want to believe the people who have actually studied this for years, who are experts in the field? Because there's no reason for them to lie, because if they lie, someone else in the system will point it out and their reputation will be shot. That's how the system works in research.
One possible explanation is media. Our media is not doing its job well. The media is very much politically biased. You look at our media, they are not telling us the truth. There's, for example, climate change. They say we want to balance the argument. So there's one person who is for and another person who is object to it. But we know that 99.5% of the scientists say no, climate change is real. So if you want to balance, then you will need 995 scientists against 5 people who object to it. That is the balance. But unfortunately, our media say one person from the support, one person from, this is biased, totally biased. I think there's, and another thing is, in the West, all the media is controlled by a handful of people.
What's going to happen when we get rid of the ABC?
That is even worse, isn't it? A little bit of sense. Now, ABC is still highly biased at the moment because they still have to appease the government for the funding.
Yeah,
it's still a little bit better. But you look at the Australian, etc. It's not newspaper; they are tabloids. And I also agree. A lot of people say, okay, I can find the information on the net. Dr. Google, everything seems, we learn everything. Sorry, it doesn't work that way. A doctor spends a bulk of their learning years, maybe 10 years, to become a doctor. You can't do a little research on the Google and then say you're an expert. But unfortunately, you're absolutely true. We are facing a problem of this one. So we really need to start respecting experts.
I don't think the ABC's as biased as you say. They give the government the middle finger from time to time. And
Yes.
I mean, you have to admit, Laura Tingle, she lays it on the line, doesn't she? And Annabelle Crabb, those ones, I think they're fabulous. But I mean, that's all we've got.
I totally agree. Yes, agree. They are a few good journalists. For example, Julian Assange, our Australian, isn't it? Is a good journalist. Or Edward Snowden, who tell us what happened in the United States, a whistleblower. These are good people. Yes, we do have good people, but the bulk of the information we are getting are controlled by a handful of people, and that is the problem.
Well, even the ABC allows, Amanda Vanstone and Tom Switzer, Ian McNamara, they're all on the ABC, and they're pretty right wing.
Yeah, but that's good though. That's the balance, I reckon.
I'm happy with that.
But I think the coalition loathes the ABC because they seem to think it should be blowing the trumpet for them, and I don't actually know why they loathe it, but I think at one of their national meetings they sort of officially or unofficially had a vote that worked towards killing it off or selling it off or something like that. You remember that a few years ago? And well, so far we've survived. I just hope the ABC does survive because, I mean, you've either got Murdoch, The Age is pretty good still, and The Guardian's good. But I think the ABC is still the best, probably. I don't know. I'd hate to see them go, really.
And the other issue is actually I watch a large number of news agencies online, including Russia Today, which is obviously speak for Russia, the Sputnik, which is also Russia, Al Jazeera, which is a Middle East African newspaper, and occasionally I will also read BBC and then the DW, the German version of it. And for on the United States side, I read Washington Post, New York Times, and then from the financial side, I also read Financial Times, which is from England. And then obviously I also watch a lot from the CGTV, which is from China, obviously. So
Al Jazeera is pretty much in the middle, isn't it? I'm not quite sure.
Middle East and Africa. Mostly Middle East.
They're not really communist, though, are they? They
Al Jazeera is not communist. It is Middle East mostly.
Oh, okay.
One of the points that was made earlier, I think, was regarding the political leadership. Now, with Angela Merkel retiring, people are getting nervous, saying, the only good political leader in the West is gone. It's sad, isn't it, that the political leadership today that we look around the world is quite poor, and I think the system seems to put up these people. I'm sure there are smart people around. Australia has a lot of very smart people. I've met them in my field. Mostly not in Australia, they're overseas. But why is it that I guess the political machinery is such that they just can't get to the top? Or I mean, it's quite sad. It's quite sad. I mean, as I said, in my field, I've gone to different parts of the world, and I see an expert in some field, and they say, "Oh, I was born in Australia," or and I'm Australian, and it's interesting that I'm sure you've got them in politics and others, but they just can't make any progress in the system.
Well, people are saying in the paper recently that it's these career politicians that have sort of taken over, so you don't get the fresh people coming through in the way you used to. So that could be a part of it.
Oh, there's one. I lived in Singapore for a couple of years. This may not be practicable to do in Australia. It's a cultural thing, but in Singapore, whatever it's for, what they do apparently in the PAP, the ruling party, they actually pick people who have achieved something in another walk of life. For example, if you could have been a top surgeon or a top lawyer, and so on, and they somehow persuade them to come into politics, and they are then fast-tracked into ministryship. So these are people who are brought in, and they don't have to go through this what do you call that, winning the votes at the local level to be selected. So they are actually picked and brought in, and they are paid a lot of money. I mean, they are told, I mean, you are a top surgeon. If you come into politics, we will pay you much more money. So you don't have to worry about the money part of it, because they can that will eliminate corruption as well. And say you come in. I don't know whether you can do that to some extent. Where in Australia, maybe for some good seats, some blue ribbon seats, pick someone, who's achieved in some other field, and try to bring them in and get a few more of those people in.
I think the other issue is in here we have to volunteer to be elected, and then getting elected is a different kind of skills from our professional experience. For example, I'm a teacher. I might be a little bit better to speak to people, but as a teacher, I always speak in an authoritarian tone because I'm the provider of knowledge, right? But if I'm going to go out and then say I put myself up for election, probably the people will say, "Hey, you are too proud of what you are saying. You are always authoritative. You are not sufficient understanding to my problem." And another issue is I don't have the patience to listen to stupid arguments.
No, I was just trying to respond to the comment that Anthony made about these career politicians. People have come through the system and so on, and they are assistants to some MP, and then they work in the MP's office, and then they go up the system. So to counter that, we have to get people from outside, who are from outside politics. But I take the point you're making. They may not have certain skills, and that's why culturally it may be difficult to do that. But to some extent, you have to be able to persuade people who are fresh, who are from outside the system, to come in.
Yeah. Another thing is very interesting. You look at our politicians; most of them study law. And if you look at other countries, Singapore, I suppose that's not the case. As you say, there are surgeons coming in. They come from different background. For example, in China, since Deng Xiaoping, all the presidents of China are all engineering based.
Yeah, I know.
Xi Jinping is also a chemical engineer. Every one of them, from after Deng Xiaoping, all of them are engineers. Okay.
Angela Merkel was a quantum chemist. She's a PhD in chemistry.
So what we actually really need is somebody from science which looks at reality rather than imagination. We need to go back to the real thing. Look at for example, the Chinese policy. Chinese have been changing very rapidly in the last 40 years. Okay, but if we look at all its policy, it always starts as a child policy somewhere in China first. After the child, they will modify the policy and then expand it a little bit into a much larger area. And then when it is successful, then they implement it throughout China. This is the science experimental concept. We experiment and find out whether it's work or not, and then look at the results. And from the results, we might change our experiment. We might change our method in order to get a result. What we need is more science going into our politics.
Yeah, true.
Does that help on the issue of public or housing that was mentioned in one of your videos, the number of people who don't have housing in New York? Well, it's a bit, what's happening in Australia is that housing prices are rising much faster than anybody's income. And where is this going to finish up? And is the idea of public housing the answer? It's pretty hard to get governments at the moment to spend a lot of money on public housing, but
Singapore is a good example, isn't it? Singapore has a lot of public housing. So, well, there's another unfortunate thing about the real estate here, as well as I come from Hong Kong. In Hong Kong, I would have to work a whole life in order to afford an apartment in Hong Kong. So we become slaves to our apartment. And then if I were a little bit better off, my parents might have provided me with the initial first installment. Then I will get an early start. But unfortunately, I'm not in that situation. So I have my start quite late. But once I decided to leave Australia leave Hong Kong and come to Australia, I sold my partly paid off apartment in Hong Kong and was able to pay off my house here in Australia.
Wow.
So that is a big difference.
Yeah.
But today, the problem is my daughter, if she wants to get started in a neighborhood near me in order to look after me, it's almost impossible. Our neighborhood, the minimum is already talking about million, $1 million, $2 million. Come on, she won't be able to afford it.
Some of you, of course, were born here. I came to Australia in the 1980s. So I lived here almost sort of half my life. I find in that time, Australia has become a more unequal society. I can see it myself.
Yeah, oh, definitely.
I mean, it's so stark for me to see this, that it has become a more unequal society. In some ways, it is looking a bit like Asian countries. You know, in Sri Lanka, in Colombo, you can't buy a place. There's too much money chasing a little land, you know. Yeah. It's happening in a lot of these Asian countries. Just can't afford anything.
No.
And Australia is going that way.
Now, the China also going in the same way, but the Chinese government is now putting a stop on it. What the Chinese government is saying is, your housing is for living, it's not for investment.
Yeah, definitely.
So once we do that, that means the government charge a huge commission or tax, whatever, for your second house. You do that, and then stop foreigners from investing in our property market. I know part of the reason why Australian property have been rising is the money coming from China. I understand it. Money coming into China, of course, it's good, but on the other hand, it also kick our next generation out of the property market. So we should stop them in that way. You want to invest in Australia? Come on, invest in something productive, like a farm, a factory, a business, not in our real estate market.
And why not remove a negative gearing?
Exactly, or remove the negative gearing. Yes, exactly. Once you remove the negative gearing, then everybody is. Now, I will understand the real estate market will drop, but depending on how much it's dropped, we have to consider our next generation. Yes, my property will probably cost worth less, but I'm living in it. I'm not selling, so to me, it's not an issue, right? But for the next generation, they want to get into the market. They can't at the moment, and so we need to provide them with, or alternatively, use the Singapore model, a lot of public housing. The public housing, when you move it, unless the building is going to be rebuilt, this is your place for the rest of your life. You don't have to move again. You move into a public housing and they expect to be there, and then you look after your housing, right? And Germany is also the same. In Germany, the number of people owning property is about 40%. Most of the people rent forever. But as long as your rent is affordable, your rent will not pay off a building, an apartment. But one of the issues today, the young people doesn't want to rent is our rent is very expensive. What is holding them back is the first installment. they can afford the first installment, the mortgage and the rent is almost the same. But that is unfair. That's unfair.
Is there any regulation on our housing for foreign investment in it? I thought they'd put the brakes on it a bit. But...
Yeah, they have put the brakes on it. The foreign investment here has to be a new property. Okay, you can't buy second hand, and when you sold, it's always second hand. Foreign investment in property must be first hand, so you buy from the property developer. But there is also still as Chinese people getting rich, they want to diversify their portfolio. And to them, getting a place in Australia is good because we have lovely air, lovely water, lovely space. Melbourne is still one of the most livable cities in the world.
Albert, if that is the case, why is it that a lot of rich Indians are not buying in Australia, but rich Chinese are? There are a lot of rich Indians. There are 100 million very rich Indians, but they're not buying here.
I don't know why, but the Chinese like to buy property anywhere they go. It's just the mentality. This is the Chinese mentality. You go somewhere, you settle there, you buy a property and stay there. So that's why when I decide to come here, the first thing I do is buy a property.
Albert, if you ever decided to stand for politics, I'd vote for you.
Probably not. I passed the time when I am ambitious enough to be a politician. I'm not that kind of people.
Actually, we're getting a lot of independent people now standing, so there might be some hope yet.
Yeah, we hope so. Okay. Okay, we'll see you next week then.
Yes, and that's the last session next week.
Yep, there will be a session next week as well. Okay, see you then. Bye.
So what are you going to do next year, Albert? Is this continuing next year, or are you starting again?
I will be only continuing on Zoom. I'm not going to do face-to-face anymore.
But is it going to be a continuation of this one, or are you going back to the beginning, to the Big Bang and all that?
I'm not going to go into the beginning. I will be continuing. Still haven't finished yet.
Okay. Okay.
Okay.
Bye.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.